book called Journeys, A Poet's Diary. With I have two editors with me on the panel, Guillermo and Krishna Ramanujan. Before they have actually planned a very, you know, they've planned a set of readings combined with comments from different parts of this book that has 5 big sections. Before they start their readings and commentary, a very quick note on A.K. Ramanujan himself, for those who may not have heard of him or read him. A.K. Ramanujan was born in Mysore in 1929. He did his schooling and college there. He studied English literature in his BA and MA at Mysore University. Between 1951 and 1959, for 8 years, he taught English literature at different colleges in different cities such as Quailon, Madurai, Belgaum, and Baroda. He did his PhD in linguistics on Kannada grammar at Indiana University, Bloomington, in 1963. Before he finished his thesis, he had already started a job, a faculty position at the University of Chicago in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations. He worked here until his death, an unexpected death in 1993. AKR, as you know, is so versatile. It's hard to classify as an academic who does this and not that. His contributions are truly wide-ranging and across very many fields. He wrote original poetry in Kannada and in English. 3 collections of poetry in English, starting with The Striders, published in 1966, and 3 collections in Kannada poetry, starting with Hokkalli Hoovilla, and No Lotus in the Navel, published in 1969. He's, of course, famous for his translations of classical Tamil poetry and medieval Kannada and Tamil Bhakti poetry. The Interior Landscape was his first attempt at translating classical Tamil poetry, 1967. Then his Speaking of Shiva, published in 1973, which was a collection of translated vachanas from medieval Karnataka, of course, very well known. Hymns for the Drowning, which he publishes 8 years later, 1981, has selections from the Nammalvar saints, Shaiva saints from Tamil Nadu. Samskara, a novel written by U.R. Ananthamurthy, AKR's translation is very famous. He also has interest in folk tales, as a collector of folk tales as well as an interpreter. Folk Tales from India, published in 1991, collects together his folk tales in his own translation, but his interest in folk tales as well as classical and medieval Kannada poetry goes way back to his teens, actually. There's an excellent anthology of his non-fiction / academic essays called Collected Essays of A.K. Ramanujan, published in 1999, which I dip into whenever I need intellectual excitement. It's got essays on Bhakti, essays on Indian religion, on folktale. Very, very helpful discussions there. So this is a quick introduction to this very versatile mind called A.K. Ramanujan. After his death, his family bequeathed the personal papers that were in over 71 boxes, as the book editors say, that were collections of his writings between 1944 and 1993. And they were at the University of Chicago. And Guillermo, for his book on A.K. Ramanujan's poetics, was the first researcher to work with them. And this is the second book to come out of an engagement with that material. Okay. Very, very quickly, Guillermo and Krishna, how did you decide to work on this book? Was there a method? And what do you think needed to be done in order to arrive at something like this? Guillermo?
I think Guillermo should begin to introduce the book.
Well, thank you, Chandan. I'm delighted to be here. This is, for me, it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to do this session with A.K. Ramanujan's son, Krishna, who just arrived from the US. As you know, A.K. Ramanujan lived in Chicago, and it is there where his papers were kept at the University of Chicago. where he's taught for many years. Just think of it. We are going to introduce you to a writer, a scholar, a translator who came from South India and who left South India in the late 1950s. And even though he moved to Chicago in the late 1950s and studied literature while he was in India throughout the 50s and was teaching, studied literature in the late 1940s, and in the 1950s he was teaching in various colleges and universities, even in SN College in Koilon, here in Kerala. And he moved to the US. He still tried to keep all his material along with him. He didn't take everything with him. He went back to India, collected some of the boxes, took them to Chicago. So imagine, for someone, imagine yourself when you have a long career, and if you travel around India, or if you even a lot of the people, scholars that have moved to the US, many of them, they lose their documents, or you lose your papers. You don't keep everything. But we are so fortunate, and I think this should be mentioned, that he was quite meticulous in storing all this material. And another very important fact or incident was that the family generously, Molly Ramanujan, gave it to Chicago University. And American universities know that papers, archives, are crucial to interpret our past, our present, and our future. And I'm saying this because I think there's not been given due importance in India for archives and for material like this. I don't know what they've done or they're going to do with papers on Ananthamurthy, and that's why I want to stress this point, that we're so fortunate. I was able to write my PhD, and we were now able to do this book because A, the scholar, poet, man himself kept all these diaries along his notes, and B, they were stored at Chicago University. So when I went there and discovered some of the material that was of interest to my academic book, along with it, I could realize there were personal diaries. Not all of them, because they were kept in other parts, in other boxes, which said personal diaries, restricted access till 2014. And I went on the papers around the year 2000. My contribution was more scholarly, but I could get a glimpse of some of those diaries, personal diaries, which I thought should be published. So I approached Krishna, and I told him, have you ever thought of bringing out an edition of the diaries? Don't you think we should give it a try? And would you like to join hands with me? And he very generously agreed. I wasn't sure he would, because I know a lot of people kept writing to him proposing projects. And I thought, well, there's a chance to shed some light on his inner perspective. The inner, not the public figure, the inner, the Akam in Puram, we'll talk about it. So I don't want to extend this further, but I think it was a very generous move on Krishna's part to accept to come on this journey, and he'll explain it now how we worked to make it happen. And it's thanks to the fact that the personal diaries were available after 2014, and the treasure house we found there, because the first piece I was really struck by is, imagine you're doing a scholarly work on somebody's, on a big name like Ananthamurthy or Girish Karnad and all these. We're talking about a generation that is no more. They have all mostly passed away. And you suddenly discover that not only did he write translations and poetry, but you find these very beautifully written, aesthetically written writings, diaries. And I found this piece that he wrote on the ship when he came in 1959 from Bombay. via France, and I tell more about how he missed the original route because there was a problem with the engine, and they had to go via cross France, end up in UK, and then make it all the way to New York. So I found the diary he wrote on the boat, and that was such beautiful material. It almost read as a movie. You could make a film about it. And I sent it to Krishna, and he thought, yeah, maybe we could do something about this. Krishna.
Yes, thank you all for coming out today. The entry on the boat trip was indeed a very beautiful piece of writing that we both, as Guillermo had said, he had already said to me what value it might be to publish it. But I think the book turned out very well, and part of why that is Guillermo and I talked a great deal before we started about what the vision was of the book. And we had very clear idea of making this a book about the work itself and my father's thoughts on his process of creativity, and as well as including drafts that were literary in themselves, either poetry drafts or travel logs. And so that gave the book a very good focus of it being about his work. So with all of that in mind, we collected the materials. They were all handwritten. It was quite meticulous work to transcribe everything from handwriting into a text that we could then work with. So that was roughly our process, and then we began to shape it, decide which materials to include and what not to include. And at the end, I think we felt that we had quite a nice, cohesive book that I think turned out well and informs the discussion about my father's larger oeuvre. So thanks so much.
Before we move on to the readings, do you want to say a quick something about your principle of selection, what you chose to include in this book?
Okay, let's talk a little bit about this, but let us make or turn this into a homage to the work and the diaries themselves. We would like you to share with us, we would like you to share our experience we had while reading them, and the way we can do this is by reading some of the extracts. So if you're ready for it, if you want to come on a journey with us, we are all on almost, this looks like very much, we're by the sea, and we're going to talk about ship journeys, so come on a journey with us. Let's just think we're on a boat, and we're going to read. We're not quite on the boat yet. We're going to start in the 1940s when he was 19, 20 years old, and we'll move on chronologically, and we want to take you on a ride on this journey from India to America, if you're ready for it. I think we don't want to turn this into an academic exercise. Of course, the criteria was it had to work. The text should speak by itself. So it's a journey of ideas, but it's also an aesthetic journey. We selected items and pieces that were of value and that would speak to us from the creative artist point of view. This is the journey of an artist. We didn't want to go into his personal life or into his relationships, only in as far as they would relate to his work. And not even about his abstract ideas or his scholarly ideas, but only in relation to his creative work, even the translation work, which was very intimately related to his poetry. Is that right? Yeah? So you want to add on to this, to that idea of selection?
I think we can get started
Yes.
maybe with the readings.
Yeah. So are you ready for the journey? Okay. So we'll read some of the extracts of Journeys, A Poet's Diary by A.K. Ramanujan, edited by Krishna Ramanujan and Guillermo Rodriguez.
Okay, thank you. So the first entry we have is from Mysore, 25th September 1949. And it's a naive piece, but reveals actually at 20 years old, a very practiced, precociously talented writer. He was 20 years old, but he was writing about a self that was a little bit younger. And this piece is a recounting of his efforts to compose a poem. So it's his younger self, a narrative about composing a poem and facing a kind of struggle that all artists face in finding time to create amidst the banalities of everyday life. So I'll begin here with A Poem is Born. He was writing a poem, definitely not about the rapture of roses and the languors of lilies. He would not be conventional, old phrase, a panderist to the public. No, not the life for him. Tinned poetry, he called it, stale stuff, not that for him. Good or bad, he would be himself, write himself, have his own home industry of phrases, where he turned poetic pottery at the whirling wheel of his own imagination. He would be clay, pot, potter, painter, and the tanning, fixing sun, all in one. The fancy pleased him immensely. He wrote it down in his daybook. He had a small, neat hand with rather feminine curves and angles. He admired it secretly, thought of a young, worship-eyed posterity, thought of how he shyly concealed all that behind a modest mask of diffidence, which had the trick of becoming agonizing real too often, the mask growing into the face. He locked all those thoughts down. They were getting out of hand. He must think of the poem, his second. Also now, I'll move on to another section. Since we're here in Kerala, by the lovely beach, we felt it appropriate to read a brief selection from AKR's early adulthood, where he taught literature as a professor in the South. He taught at Koilan from 1950 to 1951. My mother, Molly, was born in Kerala. And this describes a simple description where he gets out of himself. He's not focused on himself, but focused on the externalities. And he describes or reports about life. We see this over and over in the book, these sort of observational perspectives that are very good reporting.
This piece is written in the first person. The previous one he writes in the third person, he, because he's a bit self-conscious. So he said, no, I should not write in the first person. He was probably feeling it was something more of a piece, a prose piece. Now this is more of a typical diary. So this is 18th March 1951. We cycled up to Nindakara Bridge through bad road and village parts, had a swim in the backwash of the sea, where the sea overflows into the backwaters. A wonderful sight, the placid sea, with milky, silky trails of rippling foam arising just at the meeting places of sea and backwater. A distant, misty ship, moving as it moved not, still rapidly on the horizon, and a lovely blown sail, and a silhouetted one-man boat. The bridge, long with wooden planks, shivers and rattles when buses go on it horribly. RK even did a ballet dance on the neat black and white sands of the shore, a most delightful outing. So a lot of these diaries are about his friends in those years, and the trips around the landscape, and how he had, I think, a very intimate relationship with a group of friends, and some of them were even Kannadigas, some were Keralites. This is his first years, and this was his first posting as a teacher at SN in Column. So very young guy, and quite naive in many ways, and I think those were quite happy years for him in a way.
This next selection, we're going to read a poem, a very famous poem by my father called A River. And this part of what we're trying to show through the diary entries is how his entries in the diaries kind of percolated through him. He would write them down, and they would appear later in his formal work. You'd see aspects of the diaries the experiences he had in the poetry itself. This is an example of that. He was in Madurai here. In July 1951, he had an appointment as a lecturer at Thiagaraja College. And so during this period, this was just after independence in the early 50s, and India was going through something of an identity crisis. And there were many young modern Kannada poets, writers, including Gopala Krishna Adiga, U.R. Anantamurthy, and Girish Karnad, all of them who were people that my father met at this time. And they were all part of this early Navya movement of writers who were against literary orthodoxy and religious tradition in general, and they sought a new, modern, experiential ethic. And so this famous poem embodies his kind of anti-traditional tendencies, where the poetic, romantic, religious is replaced by something a little more realist, cruel almost, the cruelty of nature, impartiality, pragmatism. So we see this contrast between tradition and anti-tradition.
So I'm reading a poem now. This is a famous, one of the most oft quoted poems that he wrote, A River. In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, every summer, a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them. The wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets sang only of the floods. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows, named Gopi and Brinda, as usual. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before birth. He said, the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and 1 pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no molds on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart. So you could see the irony involved, and it's a critique in his way. So he was not a political poet, but the irony as a mode is, of course, a trait of modernist poetry. But obviously he's also talking about the kind of old traditional poets that were in vogue before the Navya, the new poetry movement, which looked at everything from a romantic point of view. You know, what's romantic about people drowning? And the best way he does it with this is typical ironic mode. So there's a critique to the other tradition of the poets. You want to move over? You're in the sun. I think you should move over here, Krishna. It's very tough.
Maybe we could all move down.
Yeah, well, we just have a bit of a challenge with the mics here. A little bit more. No, you're still in the sun. Come. Maybe sit here. Yeah. Okay. Now we move on to the hyphen in his life, the boat journey. we're in 1959, and this is a crucial time when, after about a decade of teaching at various colleges, he was in Baroda also. He was in Madurai, he was in Koilan. Baroda was later. In Baroda, he started collecting a lot of folk tales. And he was actually doing something without knowing that he was doing anthropology. He was working on something that he knew about because of his grandmother and the traditional way of storytelling around the kitchen fire, and he just wanted to collect folk tales. That was something which kept him also intellectually alive in the 1950s. But at some point, he just became a bit fed up with the routine of teaching English to college students, teaching Shakespeare. Of course, he was very much in love with the classics. But there was no, for an ambitious person like him, who was with intellectual thirst, intellectually ambitious, it was just not enough. And he could see how a lot of his colleagues and friends made it, to the UK and the US, and I think that kind of encouraged him to apply for a Fulbright scholarship. So he applied for linguistics. He spent a year in Pune studying linguistics. He got the scholarship as a Fulbright student to move on to Indiana, Bloomington. And here he is on the ship with all this completely new experience. He had no idea what he would find. He'd only read about the West in books. And this first encounter with the alien world, there's something new. And what I like about this piece is that while we have been told so many stories about even the mathematician Ramanujan going to India and what they discovered, I think we've never heard the story being told by a poet in such an intimate way, how he finds metaphors and metaphor after metaphor in what he sees. So it's at the same time it's literal, but it's metaphorical, and it's very beautifully written. So
I'll just add one more comment about that. That we found these. Guillermo found these entries on the letterhead of the boat itself, and letterhead of hotels that he was staying at, and he had scribbled on this very beautiful travelogue over 1 month it took to travel by boat from India to the US.
Okay. So I'm going to read an excerpt. This is the Strathard ship. He boarded July 1st, 1959, which was going via Aden in Suez Canal. It was supposed to go to the UK, but one of the engines on the ship broke. Of course, it goes via Malta first, and they had to halt in Marseille and had to cross through France by train, which was a very happy accident, because he was able to go to visit all the museums in Paris, and he loved painting, and he loved looking at those masters, which also influenced him. Okay, so I'm going to read a piece dated July 17th, 1959, Malta. So he's been on the ship already for weeks, and he kind of muses about what he's seen. To have lived in dozens of such exotic places, till they are exotic no more, to have absorbed them till one understood their life ways and their stress, to live at ease among strangers. Even in India, one could have done all this, but one didn't. One feels like rushing back and gathering all that experience one has missed, all in one back-breaking burden. I seem to have gathered nothing, shared nothing of my past. Every moment seems an alarming fresh beginning. Everyone has plans, because their future is continuous with their past. I seem to carry nothing, not even ideas. I hope that fear is not true. The more I gather these images, the more intense is my craving to be a writer of prose. Fixing these tantalizing images in words, this haze, the twinkling spangles on the sunlit bays, the sky fretted by the trees that look through the arches, the penciled aerials, the blood-red oars of a green boat with a red underside, this woman in a white dress with penny-sized spots of black, the blue jersey-decked tennis players, this desire to talk to my steward. And that sad-looking, flaxen-haired small woman with a typewriter, and the sudden responsiveness of an acquaintance. And all the small hours with the heavy precession of the images of my isolation. So he felt, isolated in a way because he didn't know how to respond to all this new universe that was just unfolding before him. And there's the idea of him being in between worlds.
So this next entry actually comes a few weeks earlier. It's 6 July, and what we call come to find in the diaries a hyphen moment. He famously called himself the hyphen in Indo-American. And in these passages, we see his discomfort in his own identity. And I think this is his condition. There's the metaphor of the journey, but also I think within himself he was between worlds always, uncomfortable everywhere. And he sees this discomfort everywhere he goes. And that is seen in these writings. And at the end, there's a discussion of the Indian intellectual in the late 50s. So it's a comment on how the intellectual operated in the 50s, which also he was very, it's a place of being between. So 6 July, 1959, afloat with almost no past and no near future but the sea, just afloat in the decks of the present. Discussions are aperitifs. Time seems to have held its breath on a semicolon here, and space has a vague, slow curve going round us all over. Too many people have faith. Easily they speak of unspeakable, intense experiences, which changed them entirely and gave them and their world a new look. Today it was Miss Malani. Yesterday it was Eknath Easwaran. Both seem poised in their faith. I feel small and lost and infantile, disturbed by their peace. I was telling a young Australian how isolated an Indian intellectual is, with 16.6% who can read at all, and an overlapping 20% who are in cities like him, and only about 2% English knowing, and still fewer having his rationalist views, with fathers highly educated and mothers ignorant but strong in their hold on him, with every prudent man having a caste and insisting on it, and he having none, but not modern enough to be entirely abreast of Western ideas, because books don't come too fast to India.
Chandan, you want to comment on this? Do you think this is a way the intellectuals saw themselves in the late 50s? Because you've also worked on Anand Murthy and other intellectuals. Do you think they thought they were not up to date with what was going on in the West in terms of intellectual progress or intellectual, because books didn't arrive? We didn't have internet. I mean, this is the late 1950s. A lot of these scholars, they were trained in the classics. Shakespeare, they could recite Keats, Shelley. A lot of them were teachers of English literature, and a lot of them were Brahmins. A lot of them, in those days, they were the elite, if you want, intellectually, but at the same time, they were not part of the intellectual discourse of the West. So was there a complex, or were they slowly self-conscious, slowly getting an idea of that they were creating their own generation of homegrown intellectuals?
I see this as a mixture of an unfair characterization and a genuine sense for the corrosion, if you will, or of standards. That, he's already taught in Indian colleges for 9 years. He's done his MA in Mysore University. The heyday is almost over. There are a few great giants. I mean, important. Most of them are just settling into jobs, and I think he's responding to the lack of intellectualism among people who are formally intellectuals, in that they have jobs in colleges and universities. So it's a decline of the great, Indian universities, I think, being commented upon, and with a tinge of a certain kind of, a smugness about, about where he is and where he would like to see others be, in terms of all these things, not just their work, but the mothers are being overwhelming. They're not rationalist enough. Petty concerns have taken over. Yeah, so I think it's an image of that.
I mean, we have to put ourselves in that context. Late 1950s, how some intellectuals went abroad. Today we talk of brain drain. A lot of scientists left, a lot of intellectuals left. Some came back, some stayed, and of course, American universities were very quick at capturing all this talent. And I think the dialogue between those who left and those who stayed sometimes was broken. It was not very continuous. But in the case of A.K. Ramanujan, he always came back. He was very much rooted to his tradition, and he engaged with the classics and trained in linguistics as he was. So now we're moving to another phase. He's living in the US. This is the early 1960s. Indiana, Bloomington, there were a lot of scholars there studying linguistics and doing poetry workshops. And he eventually ended up getting a teaching post at University of Chicago because they were setting up Dravidian studies, as opposed to Sanskrit. Around the world, Indology was mainly centered around Sanskrit from the 19th century onwards. And they had an idea of setting up new centers. So this was the beginning of South Indian Dravidian studies, which is very important to South Indian studies, very crucial. So he was always ironic about the fact that when he was in India, he used to teach English literature and Shakespeare to Indian students, while when he was in America, he had to teach American students about Dravidian languages. So it's the opposite. There's another irony here. So why is that? No, because we started 10 minutes late. We'll continue for another 20 minutes. We will end. Yeah. Okay, so then what arises in this process is the question of identity. So who am I? Am I made up of multiple identities? What is my background? Where am I going? And this is kind of the new phase we're going through here. I'm going to introduce this topic, and then Krishna will read one of his iconic poems about identity, if you want. So he ends this boat journey, and a few days afterwards, he thinks, I want to write something about this. So in retrospective, he tries to interpret what he's experienced on the boat journey, and he types some of those diaries and puts them more into a formal shape. I'm just going to read 3 or 4 lines, which end with a quote by Ezra Pound. It's from one of his poems, and I'll quote when he quotes, okay? And then I'll have Krishna read the poem. Notes towards a journal, the journey. As one is disengaged from the family, the familiar, everything puts on the stranger look of a symbol. The journey itself, the seed's self-exile, the salt estranging sea. The towboat, the guy ropes, the receding wharf, with its belittled crowd, its motley of mothers and wives, waiting for the emptiness. The sudden need for telescopes. There's everything here, but everything is anonymous till one sees, quote, the faces in the crowd.
Self-portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father.
Krishna, can you read that again? Because it's a very. Can you repeat it again? Now listen to what he does in the poem. It's a very tricky. He plays. See, his poems are like artifacts, and he plays with the reader. The main metaphor is the mirror, but the mirror. You know what a mirror does? A mirror. I mean, not a mirror. It's actually glass. You know, glass refracts and reflects. It does both things. You can look through glass, and depending how the sun shines, so he's walking past the shop window, he sees through it, but at the same time he sees himself, but it's not quite a mirror. And when I found the first draft of this poem, next to it there was a note saying Borges, the Argentinian poet who wrote about the doppelganger, like how you are a double. So there's the idea of him and somebody else, who is that other self. In the family tree, you have the father, and what's the genetics of the what are you made up of? You're many things. So there's I'll read it again. Self-portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. So the time is pressing, and we would like to share with you a few more items. We have a few more minutes left. Yeah.
I'll skip.
Yeah, but
I'll skip to the end of the book.
yeah.
And in conclusion, my father died very unexpectedly on July 13th, 1993. And it was quite a shock that day. My mother and sister and I left the hospital, and we were very shocked. We did not expect it. And we ended up on the lawn at the University of Chicago has what they call the quadrangle. It's a big open area with Gothic buildings and lawns and things. And we were sitting there just silently, and we noticed that the university had hung the flag at half-mast. They had lowered it to half-mast out of respect for my father. And so we walked over there, and on the flagpole, someone had taped this poem, A Hindu to His Body. And talking to Chandan earlier, he said on that day, himself and some of his friends had pinned that same poem to a chalkboard at the university where he was. So it seems to have some sort of resonance for people in reference to my father. So Guillermo will read from this last poem, A Hindu to His Body.
Again, keep in mind he's in an ironic mode, but he was a Hindu who threw away his Brahmin thread at the age of 16. So keep that in mind when interpreting this poem. A Hindu to his body. Dear pursuing presence, dear body, you brought me curled in womb and memory, gave me fingers to clutch at grace, at malice, and ruffle someone else's hair, to fold a man's shadow back on his world, to hold in the dark of the eye, through a winter and a fear, the poise, the shape of a breast, a pair's silence in the calyx and the noise of a childish fist. You brought me. Do not leave me behind. When you leave all else, my garrulous face, my unkissed alien mind, when you muffle and put away my pulse to rise in the sap of trees, let me go with you and feel the weight of honey hives in my branching and the burlap weave of weaver birds in my hair. A very Upanishadic, very much there in the Upanishads as well. He wants to be part of nature. Let him live in eternity like his work does. A man at work is still alive through the art he or she has created. And here we are discussing his work. And it's there in the poems. So I hope you enjoy the poems. I hope that the book will encourage other young readers especially to get acquainted with this and enjoy the poems. That's why we've not mentioned it, but we've put on purpose, we've added into the selection drafts that were unpublished as well as published drafts so that people could get a chance to enjoy the work as he wanted it to be read. So now we can, you want to add any?
Just also that the published drafts were put in to reflect some of the ways that those ideas were early in the diaries, things he was working out that ended up being formalized in those poems. So we wanted to show that process a little bit. And just thank you all for coming out today. Thanks so much.
We want to take some questions, please, from the audience.
Well, thank you very much for this. I have a couple of questions. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Can you hear me now? All right. So I have a couple of questions. The first question is really, I mean, it's for all three of you. You know that when you look at the work of someone like, let's say, V.S. Naipaul, what you find is that the fiction is remarkably different from the travelogues. Okay? The fiction has got a sense of humor. There are multiple selves, which you don't really find in the non-fiction. Now, Chandan, you started by introducing Ramanujan, as we know, as a man of extraordinary versatility. I mean, he writes poems, he's a folklorist. I actually admire most of all the essays, and there are these classic essays such as Is There an Indian Way of Thinking, where mirrors are windows, right? And of course a very famous essay on the 300 Ramayanas, which became very controversial for all kinds of reasons. So here's the question. The question is, are there different selves reflected in different bodies of his work? That is that, does the poetry point to a self which the essays don't point to, you think? Does the poetry in Kannada point to a different self than the poetry in English, right? I mean, that's one thing that I'm interested in trying to understand. The second question is, and I think that you've sort of spoken to it very briefly when you've spoken about the drafts. But, you know, for example, many years ago, I did an extensive amount of work on Henry David Thoreau, who kept extensive journals. And then when you read a book like Walden, what you find is that huge chunks of Walden were actually taken from journals which go back 10, 15 years. Now, do you find something, as opposed to a draft which you continue reworking, do you find that, for example, in the essays, that there were segments of it which were in a sense already composed, which are present in either the drafts that you looked at or in the papers, right? In other words, we'd have to have some idea of the way in which he worked. What was the nature of intellectual work for him? That's what I'm trying to understand. Yeah.
I mean, these are very complex questions, but let me just try to sum up. I believe there are two questions. First of all, he worked in different genre, yes, and he worked in different languages. But for him, he was like more like an alternating monolingual. He said he was comfortable with writing in in Kannada and in English. That's his creating, right? But he was working with Tamil also. not so much with Malayalam, but also, and a little bit in Sanskrit. But he was multilingual, and he was multidisciplinary, and each aspect of his work interacted with his other aspect. So it was not a contradiction for him. In fact, my thesis is about that. And if you want to know more about it, it's my whole exercise was I was trying to prove how his creative writing contaminated his essays, and how his essays, contained a lot of the essence that he just said in a few words. And it's all organically, it's more or less like a tree, with different branches. And his essays are also written with aesthetics in mind. They're very carefully constructed, if we can say so. So each piece, and he also believed in intertextuality. He quotes himself, and there are passages in his essays that are phrases from poems, and he just puts this all together into an organic whole. And sometimes he does the opposite. There's a whole piece, and he just chops it into pieces. So intertextuality and how one contaminates the other is very much there as an organic whole. Yes.
Can I respond one? I just wanted to make one little comment about that. I felt that, at heart he saw himself as a poet, and his highest self came out in his poetry. The voice is a large voice. It's a voice that is outside of himself. And that was a beautiful contrast in the diaries themselves, because they're very self-absorbed and very self-centered. But you don't see that voice in the poetry. Once he set his mind to write poetry, you see a more universal perspective that comes out. That's has a large outline looking at things. And that's it was a very interesting shift he was able to make from a doubting personal self into a sort of more abstracting, larger self that was quite all-seeing. So I'll just stop there since we're running out of time.
Yeah, we've run out of time. Yeah. Okay, we'll end here. Thank you, Kerala Literature Festival. You want? Sorry.
Ask the question and then we'll close.
Who's got a question?
She's got a question.
Oh, you
Okay,
have a
sir.
question.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
That's the end of the session.
We can discuss now. We have to end here. I just want to say one thing, and that is, please read A.K. Ramanujan if you want to know more about yourself, more about India, and just enjoy a journey which will take you to many places. So I hope you can get and grab a copy of the book. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Now to provide the